Morning settled softly over Egypt, folding gold across the courtyards and whitewashed walls. Joseph had learned to wake before the sun finished rising, to meet the day while the air was still kind. His linen robe brushed the smooth floor as he crossed the servants' hall, quiet as the house itself. The rhythm here was new, but he carried rhythm in his bones now, a habit of listening before moving. The household stirred around him, and the murmurs of men drawing water mixed with the low call of women grinding grain. Potiphar's house was a world of discipline. Every sound had its reason, every step its measure. Joseph walked inside that order as if he had always known it, though everything in this land was foreign. The scent of oil instead of smoke, the painted eyes of gods watching from every wall, the language that wrapped itself around him like a song he almost understood. He worked without complaint and learned quickly. At first he carried water, cleaned stone, tied bundles of linen for washing. Then he noticed how small mistakes cost time and how silence opened doors. The chief steward saw the same things and began to trust him with more. When others rested, Joseph stayed in the storehouse, measuring grain by feel and watching how light fell through the lattice to mark the hours. Potiphar noticed the quiet improvement in his house, the way small things no longer fell apart. He saw a foreign boy whose hands brought order and whose eyes carried peace. So he placed the boy over his servants and let him handle the fields, the stores, the accounts. Soon Joseph's name moved from room to room like a gentle command. Potiphar's wife watched too. She saw a young man whose patience made power look effortless. At first it was curiosity. Then it became hunger disguised as admiration. She crossed the courtyards when he was near, lingered longer at the well, let her voice drop softer when she spoke his name. Joseph sensed the shift before she spoke it. He knew what it meant when her words grew slower and her eyes stopped at his hands. He turned away each time, but temptation waits longer than any man can measure. One noon when the house was quiet and the air trembled with heat, she called him again. He stepped inside, meaning to finish his task, but her hand found his sleeve. Her voice carried want and accusation in the same breath. He felt his pulse climb, not from desire, but from fear of dishonor. He told her no, not harshly, only with the kind of steadiness that holds its ground. Yet refusal sounded like insult to a heart unused to denial. She reached again, stronger now. His robe tore as he turned, and he left the cloth in her hands and ran. For a moment, the stillness in the house broke apart like a vessel dropped on stone. Her cry followed him down the corridor, a cry not of shame but of fury. When Potiphar returned, her story waited for him, rehearsed and painted with convincing pain. She held out the torn linen like proof. The servants echoed what she wanted them to say, fear bending their words. Potiphar stood silent through it all. He looked once at the garment, then at Joseph. He saw guilt and innocence struggling inside a silence that could not defend itself. He had known both his wife and this servant long enough to sense more than words revealed. But a house must not divide against itself. He sent Joseph away, not with rage, but with a weary decision, a punishment heavy enough to end the noise, light enough to ease his conscience. Joseph was led through the streets, where the sun glared on stone, and every step echoed the end of what he had built. The prison waited near the lower quarter, cut deep into earth. Iron doors swallowed the light, and the air carried the smell of water that never dried. The guards spoke little. Chains spoke for them. Inside, time slowed until it became another kind of silence. Joseph sat on the ground and pressed his hands together to remember their purpose. The walls sweated with damp, and each drip of water from the ceiling fell like a question. Why here? Why now? But he did not let bitterness take root. He worked again, because work was the one prayer he could still offer. The keeper of the prison watched him repair what others ignored. He watched the way other men's anger calmed when Joseph passed. One morning he handed Joseph a ring of keys and said nothing. From that day, Joseph oversaw the prisoners, the food, the order of days. The keeper rested easier. Even in chains, Joseph's touch brought life into the place that smelled of death. Men began to rise earlier, speak less cruelly, trust that their stories had not yet ended. And somewhere in the slow dark, Joseph learned to believe that God was not only in altars and sunlight, but also in rooms where no one sang. Days stacked on each other like bricks that never dried. The light that crept through the slit above his cell was thin, a ribbon that measured time by dust. Joseph learned the sound of each guard's step, the way chains rasped when men turned in sleep. The prison breathed, slow and heavy, but he breathed with it. Work gave shape to the hours. He swept, carried, counted, mended, small tasks that asked only hands, not explanations. Word spread in the underworld of walls. The keeper trusted him, so others followed. A man whose anger once cracked stone now helped clean the troughs. Another who had forgotten speech began to hum again. They didn't know why, only that something steady had entered the place and refused to leave. Joseph felt no triumph in that. He simply moved, prayed without voice, and waited for God in the rhythm of labor. The days taught him patience the way drought teaches land to hold water. Then 2 men arrived from Pharaoh's court, pale from the sunlessness of palace life, their clothes torn, their eyes raw from fear. The cupbearer and the baker, both fallen from favor, both wrapped in mystery. They were placed under Joseph's care, another task, another test. The nights were long for them. They whispered of rumors and the nearness of death. Joseph listened, but offered no false comfort. He had learned that presence could be mercy without words. One morning they woke shaken, eyes wide with something that had followed them out of sleep. Dreams had visited and refused to explain themselves. Joseph knelt by them, not as a judge, but as a listener. He asked them to tell what they saw. The baker spoke first. His voice trembled. Baskets of bread, white on his head, birds coming down, pecking until nothing remained. Then silence. The cupbearer spoke next. Vines with 3 branches, bursting into fruit, pressed into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph closed his eyes. The answers stood plain before him, yet he wished they hadn't. He told them what truth required. The cupbearer would rise again to serve the king. The baker would not see another dawn. They listened with the stillness of men staring at the edge of what cannot be changed. When Joseph finished, he asked for one thing only, that the man restored remember him. When you stand before Pharaoh, speak my name. The words cost him humility he had learned painfully. 3 days later, the feast came. The court remembered the cupbearer's grace and the baker's fault. One was lifted, the other hung, and the dream became flesh. And when the cupbearer's hands poured wine again, the memory of the Hebrew boy dissolved like steam above the chalice. Forgetfulness can be louder than betrayal. Joseph returned to work, to the endless count of jars and chains and the ache of unanswered prayers. But the ache did not poison him. He tended it as one tends a lamp, trimming the wick, guarding the flame from draughts of despair. Seasons changed. He could smell it even in that stone box, the shift of the river wind, the taste of new harvest far above. His hair grew long, his beard thicker. Lines formed at the corners of his eyes, not from age, but from steady endurance. He thought of dreams sometimes, his own from the hills of Canaan, but less to interpret them than to remember that they had once existed. They had not lied. They had only promised more than one lifetime could grasp at once. He learned to stop asking when. Years passed. His name meant little beyond these walls. Yet the same patience that had carried him through envy and betrayal carried him here. One night he woke to a change in the air, the kind that comes before storms. The guards moved faster, voices tight with urgency. Far above, Pharaoh had dreamed, and no one could read the message. The city stirred in panic, disguised as order. When the cupbearer heard, memory struck him like light breaking through closed lids. He spoke Joseph's name to the officials, as if he had just discovered it. The cell door opened at dawn. The keeper told him to wash, to cut his hair, to make himself presentable for Pharaoh. Water ran over his skin, carrying away dust and years. A fresh linen robe replaced the coarse prison cloth. The air outside burned brighter than he remembered. As he stepped toward the palace, the hum of Egypt grew around him. Markets waking, wheels rolling over stone, river traders calling to one another. It was all so alive, it almost frightened him. He had dreamed once of standing while others bowed, but this road to standing had passed through places no dream had warned him of. They brought him into a hall bright enough to blind. Columns rose like trees, carved with stories of gods and battles. Every surface glowed, gold, limestone, polished stone, waterlight. Joseph's feet hesitated on the threshold, not from fear, but because silence in such a place felt alive. Pharaoh sat beneath a canopy where sunlight sifted through woven reeds. The guards withdrew, and the court settled like dust. A man stood between worlds, the slave of yesterday, the interpreter of today. Pharaoh's voice carried the weariness of sleeplessness. Dreams had stalked him for nights, cows fat and sleek beside the river, then thin ones devouring them, ears of grain, full and golden, swallowed by brittle stalks. His magicians had offered words without weight. He wanted meaning, not ceremony. Joseph listened, eyes lowered, hands still. When Pharaoh finished, the room waited. Joseph's first words were not about himself. Interpretation belongs to God. Then he spoke the truth he had seen. The dreams were one. 7 years of plenty would fill the land, followed by 7 of famine that would strip the memory of abundance from every storehouse. He said it simply, as if describing the pattern of wind across water. The hall breathed again. Pharaoh's gaze stayed fixed on him. "And who," he said, "is wise enough to prepare for this?" No one answered. The silence itself pointed toward the Hebrew, standing in linen borrowed for the morning. Pharaoh rose, moved closer, and the air seemed to shift around him. He took the signet from his own hand and pressed it against Joseph's palm. "You shall be over my house." The words entered the world like a new law. A gold chain found his neck, a fine robe on his shoulders. The same hands that had bound him now dressed him in honor. Outside, a chariot waited, white horses pawing the dust. As he stepped into it, the city bent its eyes toward him, calling the Egyptian name Zaphenath-Paneah, Savior of Life. Years gathered behind him like shadows, but he did not turn to measure them. He looked forward, where the river bent toward the sea, and the fields stretched wide as hope. Work returned, but now on a grander scale. He built granaries taller than the city walls, carved channels through which grain flowed like another river. Each season filled Egypt's arms with more than it could hold. When the sky grew lean, the storehouses opened like hands, remembering generosity. He married Asenath, daughter of a priest of On, and found calm companionship in her quiet eyes. 2 sons came, Manasseh, whose name meant forgetting, and Ephraim, whose name meant fruitfulness. He whispered both in the dark, and understood that to forget pain is not to erase it, but to place it in hands larger than one's own. Years of hunger reached the land, as he had said. People from every border came to buy grain, their voices mixing in the courtyards. Joseph watched them with patience, never forgetting what had brought him here. At times, alone on the palace terrace, he would rest his hands on the stone rail and look east. The light over the desert reminded him of another horizon, a boy's horizon where dreams had first spoken. He thought of his father's face, of a coat torn and stained, of brothers whose eyes had once refused to meet his. Distance softened the images, but not their truth. He had been sold for silver, yet the thread of that betrayal had woven a larger design. He could see parts of it now, mercy hidden in misfortune, order inside loss. The God who had been silent in the pit and patient in the cell had never left him at all. Below him, the Nile turned gold with evening. Workers closed the gates of the storehouses. Torches flared. Egypt slept in safety, bought by a dream and a slave's endurance. Joseph stood quietly, robe lifting in the wind, no crown on his head, only the steady weight of responsibility. He had learned that power meant stewardship, not glory. That salvation could look like counting sacks of grain. That the same hand that had once led him into darkness had done so only to prepare him for light. He closed his eyes and let the wind carry the dust of the day away. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a famine was stirring, and a caravan would one day appear out of Canaan. But tonight, Egypt rested, and Joseph, the dreamer who had endured, rested with it. And if he prayed then, it was not with words. It was with the quiet certainty that purpose does not die in the pit, nor in the prison, nor in the palace. It waits, patient as God, for the right season to bloom.